Okay, welcome to our class today. In our previous class, we had been talking about comparative literature to translation studies. In the same topic, we had been dealing in our previous class, and today is the extension of the previous class. We will be discussing on how comparative literature is related to translation studies and what is the relation of translation studies. And we have discussed that comparative literature compares two types of literature, and the literature of two language, the literature of two cultures. So there is a relation from of comparative literature to translation studies, and we know several kinds of translation. Actually, what to what translation, and in this regard, translation studies might be considered as a subsection of comparative literature. This happens for the reason or the negative views about translation studies. And most prominent negative view is that the translation studies is not a translation of a text is not a creative writing. It is a it is not original. And also we have discussed about the several ways of translation, but the negative views comes to a turning point when Evan Johar, in his PhD thesis, he claimed that translation studies is important because when a literature will be translated, it will get audience and it will be rewritten and also it will be reread. In this regard, another writer, we have heard the name of this writer, Dryden. Dryden, in his book, Preface to the Life of Lucian, in a passage he states that in 1711 that translator ought to possess himself entirely and perfectly comprehend the genius and sense of his author. Dryden emphasized the a translator should understand the every pros and cons of the text he is translating. And if it is so, that a translation can indeed become an original in its own right, it means that if a translator translate word to word, that is a one kind of translation. But if the translator understand the metaphor, understand the other textual context, understand the other uh, cultural context of the original text, and read and reread the text, and if the translator hello.
Sir, we can hear you.
but I hear you. But I can see the what is the Zoom meeting? Yeah. So uh, what I was telling, that means John Dryden had been speaking that uh, if the translator possesses the original text, everything, context, cultural meaning, the metaphors, and rewrite it in his own way, not word to word translation, then it becomes the original of the original writing or the creative writing of the translator. Though not if the translator copied word to word. So if the translator translates or copies word for word, that would not be the original translation. So simply here we had been discussing in our previous class, that is the trans several system of translation. Okay, so if it is the word to word translation, that wouldn't be the original translation, and that a translation can indeed become an original in its own right. So uh, what might at first appear to be conflict of views expressed by the same writer is in fact simply recognition of different types of translation activities. So what Dryden is speaking, Dryden is mentioning a technique of translation. It shouldn't be word to word translation. And here, in order to measure the student's competence in learning, another kind of translation, actually, the development of bilingual dictionaries. When we speak about word to word translation, naturally, for the purpose of learning different languages, word to word translation is necessary just to have accuracy in translation. But such kind of translation is needed for learning language. But what will happen in case of a text translation, a literature translation? Dryden wanted to say that for learning language, word-to-word translation or translation accuracy is must. But such kind of translation will not be applied in case of translating literature. And in his word, Dryden said that yet at the same time, Dryden recognizes that same techniques applied to the translation of poetry would be disastrous. It means that if a poem is translated word to word, that would not be the proper way of translation studies. That is not the principle of translation studies. So, word to word translation or accuracy in translation is necessary for learning language. But in case of classic literature or other form of literature, it should be translated in several ways that mentioned by Dryden, that translator should possess the every context of the original text. That means metaphor, cultural context, and the other context the original writer mentioned. And then the translator, understanding the every context of the original text, the translator would rewrite that text, not word to word translation. So here, the need for accuracy in translation used as an instrument in teaching the foreign language was established early in remained in art. So the negative views of translation, especially when we will translate a literary text or a poem or a novel in another language, our views is remained in that way what we follow in case of learning English language or the other language or foreign language. But this technique will not be followed in translating a literary text, poems, novels, drama, etc. So what is the problem? Problem is about The activity of translation in order to demonstrate competence in the source or the target language in terms of understanding grammar and syntax is not the same thing as translating in the sense of decoding and re-encoding a literary text. Decoding and re-encoding a literary text, even though the terminology is the same for both. So the translator, we are translating a language in case of learning foreign language. We are translating a literature in case of learning another text. The terminology, that means the way we use translate or the way we use for translation, that is more or less same. But the motive or the wage is totally different. Here, another poet, Ezra Pound, he comes up with a legacy of translation. Ezra Pound, he said that we have what translation triggers different, uh, differing sets of responses relating to a different uh, letting. Interestingly, it is the pedagogic role that seems to have as something that can be measured in all important. Ezra Pound comments on the fallacy of applying such. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So Ezra Pound, he said that I ruined my English prose for 5 years trying to write English as Tacitus wrote Latin. Tacitus, a Latin poet, and Ezra Pound said that I ruined my English language when I tried to translate my prose in Latin language. Actually, Tacitus is a poet of Latin language. So Tacitus is very efficient in Latin language. Ezra Pound, uh, being a very famous poet, he himself said that actually uh, however, I may have learned something by it. That means Ezra Pound's Latin is not similar or equal to Tacitus' Latin. But with this regard, Ezra Pound said that I have learned something through the process of translating the text in Latin language. How? I know now that the genius of the two languages is not the same. Elsewhere, responding to attack by scholars on the inaccuracy of his homage to Sextus Property us as a translator, he defended his work. However, so Isra found uh, himself admitted that his Latin is not equal to the Latin poet Tacitus. However, he defended in such a way that my job was to bring a dead man to life, to present a living. Body as well. So Isra Pound, when he said about some critics said that Isra Pound's translation in Latin language is not quite good. So their point, Isra Pound answered that in translating Theseus in Latin language, what I have done, that means my job was to bring a dead man to life, to present a living figure. So Ezra Pound uh, Ezra Pound's concept of translation is focused here. So if a text gets translated, then that text will get some uh, new reader, and in this way, the poet and the text will get new life, and that is the point, good point mentioned by Ezra Pound. Same kind of feeling we have noticed by another writer's view, that is the Walter Benjamin, who, in his famous introduction to the German translation to the Baudelaire, my God, Cavaliers Parisians, is also used the metaphor of translation as the afterlife. So Isra Pound mentioned that after getting translation, the writer and the text got a new life. Same thought was expressed by Walter Benjamin. He said that uh, translation is the activity that will give a text a afterlife. Suppose for the cause of some um, uh, for the cause of written in Latin language or French language, a writer may not be, or a text may not be read by many readers. So when the text will be translated in another language, another used language, or another global language, so that that translation that translation uh, will give the text a new life, uh, afterlife. So Ezra Pound's view and the Walter Benjamin's view is more or less same. Another point I pointed out at the initial stage of this class, that whether uh, translation is an original activity or not. So here in this regard, Derrida, he has comes up with the idea of translation. Derrida's reading of Benjamin in his essay Das Tours de Babel, sorry, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
But sometimes I am getting disconnected. I don't know why. So I should make my video off. It would be, if it is so, then how can okay. Okay. Uh, so uh, in uh, what I was mentioning, that Ezra Pounds and Benjamin, they had been speaking about that translation is an activity through which a text or a writer gets new life after getting translation. But the point is that I mentioned a little bit at the very initial stage of this class, that translation is not a original activities. In this regard, Derrida comes up with his idea. According to Derrida, mm, what he suggests is a further radical attack on the idea of the primary of the original. So we said that a text is written in one language. When it will get translated, it will get in another language. Some reviewers, some critics said that when a text gets translation, it is not the original. The first one is original. Here, Derrida comes up his idea of the primacy or of the original. Who is the original? The source text, according to Derrida, is not an original at all. It is the elaboration of an idea, of a meaning. In short, it is in itself a translation. So what does it mean? It means that what we read in literature, naturally, this is some kind of idea the writer got from another source. The meaning the writer has used in the text, it is not original. So Derrida wanted to say that the text we read and the text we are going to translate, the text itself is a translation. So if it is so, so all are the original, and or all the text are in a form of translation. So Derrida pointed out in a very good way that we are speaking about the primary text. we are speaking about the original text, and we are speaking that after getting translation, the originality or privacy of the text is violated. But Derrida says that all texts are in a form of translation, either in a form of meaning, or either in a form of idea, or either in a form of contextual rewriting. The logical consequence of Derrida's thinking about translation would be the abolition of the dichotomy between original and the translation, between source and copy, and hence an end to the view that relegates translation to a secondary position. So this is Derrida's idea about translation. Again, the interest shown by Derrida and the other contemporary philosophers is a further sign of growing significance of translation and of the increasing interdisciplinary of work in translation studies. And with the growing number of the studies on aspects of the translation by philosophers, literary and cultural historians, sociolinguistics and literary theorists, and so the negative terminology has been dominated, and discussion of translation is finally beginning to disappear. So after getting such kind of reviews from Derrida, Ezra Pound, Benjamin, the negative views about translation was a bit eradicate. So translation started a new phase, and the lots of translation work had been doing after that. That means after 1771 or 18th century. The scholar following Ivan Joer, the polysystem school have tended to be European based. So Ivan Joer's, as I have mentioned a little bit about, so Ivan Joer's idea of translation study, that is the polysystem school of translation studies. So here, this school is based on European based, and with some also in the United States, and have tended to concern themselves primarily with history. It is interesting to compare the rise of translation history with the similar process that is ongoing in women studies. And in both these cases, the result is constant revision of the many of our assumptions and uh, about literary and cultural history. So the Ivan George's idea of polysystem, that means that a text will be translated in several ways. So everything, even the translator may rewrite the text in his own word. Understanding the context of the text, the translator might rewrite the text in his own language. So Ivan Choar's idea of polysystem is similar to the European-based idea or study of translation. And that is very much concerned about the history or the cultural history or the literary history, everything. And earlier in this book, it was pointed out that a great deal of existing, exciting, innovative comparative work is taking place outside Europe, often under different names, and those traditionally used by the European academician. And the same can also be said of work in translation studies. However, the other history concern, that means Ivan George's idea of translation studies is very much similar to the idea based on the European motif of translation. However, other parts of the world, we see some kind of technique of translation studies, but in different name, but in different title mm, that was meant by the author. Again, there is another approach. In Brazil and in Canada, which offer a new metaphor and the new perspectives on the significance of the translation process in case of uh, translation studies. What it is? The postcolonial theory is concerned with analyzing the aftermath, and it is concerned with the reconstruction or reassessment, which necessarily involves a translation process. So the postcolonial theory, uh, theories, the Brazil and Canada of translation theories, they implied metaphor and new responses in case of new perspectives in translation studies. So European translation is based on history. However, Brazil and the Canadian aspects of translation studies, they are very much intended to focus on the metaphor and the new perspectives in translation process. And here, Ascott et al. State that postcolonial culture is inhabitably a hybridized phenomenon involving a dialectical relationship between the grafted European cultural system and the indigenous ontology, with its impulse create or recreate an independent local identity. So here, the Brazilian and the Canadian post-colonial aspects of translation studies, they wanted to say that all cultural translation or all cultural contexts are hybridized. So, uh, so after getting translation, something will create or recreate a new identity, an independent local identity. And that is the post-colonial views on translation. So if a text gets translation in another cultural context, according to the Brazilian and the Canadian concept, post-colonial concept of translation, they said that this is a new identity. So of course, it is an original. This is their view. And in the case of the Latin America, it is involves a translator seen both as a betrayer and as a helpmate. Very interesting. And there is a text that is La Machine or Poete Mistress interpreter is a figure who symbolizes Jenna's phase of translation. One version of her life presents her as a noble Indian woman who lived with Cortes and endeavored to bring her own people all together with her lovers, uh, compatriots. Another version sees her as a betraying her own people to the invaders. So there is also the way that is the hybridization. So when a text will get translation, and there is an analogy over here. The ambiguity of interpreting the long machinist's role in the early stage of colonization is mirrored in the long listing of ambiguity experienced by Latin American writers and the critique towards Europe. Uh, the original, and recently it has been suggested that Latin America can be seen as a translation of Europe, though with translation understood in the sense argued by Benjamin and Derrida, that is, as an afterlife, a survival, a continuation through Renaissance, and not as a copy. So the Latin American literature might be a copy of the Europe, but according to Benjamin's and Derrida's view, it is not a copy. However, it is an original. Rather, the Brazilian writer interact with the source culture. Yeah. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. So ভিডিও অফ করলে আমি কিছু দেখতে পাচ্ছি না, আর ভিডিও অফ করলে মানে আপনার কথা শুনতে পাচ্ছেন কিনা সেও বুঝতে পারছি না। ওকে, rather the Brazilian writer interacts with the source culture, drawing upon it for nourishment but creating something entirely new. So the Brazilian concept of translation studies, they say that when a literature will translate it in another language, it will be a new, just as an example that Madame de uh, Grossi suggested nearly 4 centuries ago. So Heraldo and Augusto do decompose have been the principal practitioner and the theoreticians of the cannibalistic concept of translation. So here we get another idea about translation studies, what it is, and it is suggested by the two writers, Geraldo and Augusto. They say the approach of translation studies a little bit cannibal, cannibalistic, cannibalism, or cannibalistic concept of translation. What it is? That is,
স্যার
uh,
ক্যানিবালিস্টিক মানে যারা নরমাংস খাতো মানে গ্রুপ।
yeah, yeah, but how it is related to translation? They have elaborated it. If we read this, it is also যেমন একজন আহ, নরখাদক বা মাংসের একজন মানুষ যদি আরেকজন মানুষের মাংস খায় তাকে আমরা বলি ক্যালিবান। বাট ট্রান্সলেশন স্টাডিজ এর ক্ষেত্রে কিভাবে এই অ্যাপ্রোচটা কাজ করে, এখানে এসে তারা বলছে যে ইট অলসো, সরি, that is, this is a title emphasize the link between Gothi in the writer uh, and his Goethe and his famous Faustus, with referring directly to the subject to the work and the clash between the diabolical and the divine. It also resolutely asserts the presence of the translator and the writer and his relationship to the German creator. Here, uh, the interest in the very title suggests that receiving culture will penetrate and transforms the original one. From the title, we can say that translation is no longer one-way flow from the source or to the target culture, how a two-way transcultural enterprises. So here, what is the approach? Translation is for him a physical process, যেটা আমরা এর আগে বললাম যে cannibalistic approach of translation studies. So here, supporting this, translation is for him a physical process. It is a devouring of the source text, a transmutation process, an act of vampirization. ভ্যাম্পারাইজেশন, রক্ত পিপাসু বা যারা রক্ত খায়। তাহলে দ্য ক্যালিবানিস্টিক অ্যাপ্রোচ অফ ট্রান্সলেশন ইট মিনস দ্যাট কোন একটা টেক্সট যখন পুরোপুরি অন্য একটা শেপ ধারণ করে, অরিজিনাল টেক্সটটাকে পুরোটাকে ডেভার করে দেয়, গিলিয়ে ফেলে অন্য যখন একটা টেক্সট আমরা পাই, সেটাকে আমরা সেই অ্যাপ্রোচটাকে এই তারা বলছে যে হচ্ছে দ্য ক্যালিবানিস্টিক অ্যাপ্রোচ অফ ট্রান্সলেশন স্টাডিজ. So intend to erase the process. It is devouring of the source text, a transmutation process, and the act of vampirization. Translation, as he says, come transfusation. That means translation as a transfusion of blood. So the images of translation as cannibalism, as vampirism, whereby the translator sucks out the blood of the source text to strengthen her target text. So the way the vampire sucks blood from the other animals, the translator will suck everything, especially the blood and the context and the language and the other source. The translator will suck from the original text, and after getting such kind of strength, that means after getting the context, the language, the metaphors, everything of the original text, the translator will be strengthened, and then he will translate it, rewrite it, and that would be a original literary work. That is the aspects of uh, uh, cannibalistic approach of translation. And can all be seen as radical metaphors that springs from postmodernist, post-colonial translation theory. Significantly, significantly, they link up with other developments in translation theory discussed above. For what all we have in common is a rejection of the power hierarchy which privilege the source text and relegate the translator to a secondary one. So, in this concept, we have understood that just to just to put translation studies in a new identity, a secondary identity, and just to cut the link between the source text and the translated text. So this is the approach. So the cannibalistic translation philosophy is nourishing from two reservoirs, the source text and the target literature. And to the same extent, the reverse reading of translation operated by Benjamin and Derrida exposes a number of epistemological questions that is traditionally traductology to unfit to answer or using Benjamin's. So this is about the new work in Brazilian translation studies is characterized by a series of physical metaphors. Here, Brazilian translation studies, they try to place translation studies using some physical metaphor. What it is? The servile activities, similarly, development of the field of Canada from the mid 1980 decades onwards have also stressed the physical, though primarily in terms of redefined sexual relations perceived from a feminist perspective. So the Canadian aspects of translation studies. Helena Sioux has suggested the feminine writing takes place in between the two poles of the male and female. Writing is precisely working in the in-between, inspecting the process of the same and the other, without which nothing can live, undoing the work of the dead. Feminist translation theories have built upon the Siox's notion of in-betweenness. So here, just in case of feminist literary writing, we see that they will be writing about female. But Canadian approach is will not be for male or female. They will be in between. So here, Canadian concepts of literature or translation studies is just like in betweenness, developing a new ways. And Nicole Warchuk, for example, a bilingual, bicultural writer and critic, comments that the translator is being in between. So, first of all, we got the idea that translation study is not original. But next time, after getting the idea of Benjamin and Derrida, we have got the yes, there is no original text. All are a source, a means of copy. So we have come in a discussion that after rewriting the text, after getting the retranslation of the text will get a new identity, uh, the secondary identity, the afterlife, or the dead writer or the dead poet will get a new life. Here, the Canadian concept of in-betweenness, that the translator is being in between, not uh, source text and not target text. So they will play the role of in between the source text and the target text. Like words in translation, she or he endlessly drift between meanings. He or she tries to be go between to cunningly suggest that reading there could be the foreign language other than those of the chosen translation makes available. So this is the another idea, that is the Canadian concept of um, translation studies. The old binary notion of translation saw original and translated text in two poles. Feminist translation theory focuses on the interactive space between the two poles. Notes that those poles, basis of the ballet in Fidel's metaphor, that is, the source and the original is masculine and all powerful. So when যদি আমরা ট্রান্সলেশন স্টাডিজটাকে সোর্স টেক্সট থেকে আলাদা করি, তাহলে অরিজিনাল টেক্সট প্লে দ্য রোল অফ দ্য মেসকুলাইন, দ্যাট মিনস মোর ইম্পর্টেন্ট, অ্যান্ড দ্য ট্রান্সলেশন স্টাডিজ উইল বি দ্য secondary role, that means the less important. That is the binary notion of translation. The feminist translation theory, by celebrating in-betweenness, reconstructs the space in which the translation takes place as bisexual, belonging neither to one nor to the other. So the feminist translation theories imply that the translated text and the source text in between the translation studies will be, and that is bisexual, belonging not to the original, not to the target text. So this is about Canadian concepts of uh, translation studies. And then if we move forward, we will see that another Canadian translator scholar, Barbara Gobrot, has made the connection between feminist translation work and the postmodernist translation theory, arguing that although it has been traditionally been a negative topos in translation, difference is positive in feminist translation. Feminist theory has been concerned to show difference is a key factor in cognitive process and in critical uh, praxis. The feminist translator, affirming her critical difference, her delight in intermingle rereading and rewriting flaws of the sign and her manipulation in the text. So here another Canadian writer, he also, that means the Barbara Godard, Godard. He is according to him, that actually difference should be there. Different will make, will characterize that such kind of translation studies. The feminist translator, Gorbut proclaims, is uh, immodest, exploiting her possession and repossessing in the context. So according to uh, Goddard, that the feminist translator possessed or takes side from in a specific side. So uh, he is not modest. Her translator is not self-effacing, and the like the so this kind of translator, that means the feminist translator, they can play the impartial views. They have to express or they expose their identity through their translation work. This is claimed by uh, Goddard. And like to the Brazilian Luciferizing translator, she asserts her right to shape and manipulates the source text. So here Goddard saying that yes, just to shape a new one, just to manipulate the new one, manipulate the source text, the translator will create oh, a new kind of literature, and that is the field of translation studies. So yeah, how Harut, another of the Canadian translation school, proclaimed that translation practice is a political activity, and that translation is an act of linguistic invention which often enriches the original text instead of betraying it. So Canadian writer. According to this Canadian writer, he mentioned that actually the translation doesn't betray the source text. However, translation is an expansion of the original text, or the source text. So again and again, we are getting such kind of view, that is, the translation is not a fake, or it's not a secondary kinds of writing. However, it doesn't betray the source text. However, it is an extension of our text. As Derrida and Benjamin, they mentioned that, and also even Isra Pound mentioned that after getting translation, the writer and the poet and the writing will get a new life, a afterlife, a new reader, or a new sets of reader the translated text will get. So this is the view of the translator. So uh, post-colonial notion of translation, which contest the old imperialistic view. So we'll not read this. So even Joer's approach we have understood, that is the polysystem theory in translation, and also it is often difficult now to see it merely as a subcategory. So after getting all the idea about translation studies, now the question comes that translation studies, is it under, it is a subcategory of comparative literature? So the title suggests that what is the links? What are the links between translation studies and comparative literature? So, and in my initial stage, I said that translation studies might be a subcategory of comparative literature. Now, after getting such kind of views after views, after getting so many approaches of translation studies, now it is a point, what can we call, what should we call translation? It is often difficult now to see it merely as a subcategory of comparative literature. So after getting so many ideas, we can't say that translation studies is a subcategory of comparative literature, partly because the term comparative literature, as this book has sought to show, has little meaning today. Not that it is ever had much meaning from the outset, partly because it is such a dynamic subject area, while comparative literature as a formalist exercise is in decline. So here, there are, of course, the different schools of thoughts about the relationship between translation studies and comparative literature. So comparative translation studies is not a subcategory of comparative literature, though we have another different approach in translation studies. So it is it is uh, there are, of course, several schools of translation studies and comparative literature. So we can say that translation studies is not a subcategory of uh, of comparative literature. Rather, it is a different or a important field of literature that can be called the translation studies. That is a new approach or new uh, genre in literature. So the translation studies, the proper concern of what we historical or the linguistics. Okay, so the translation is not just a window open to another world, or some or such pious platitude. Rather, translation is a channel opened, open, not without a certain reluctance, though, through which foreign influence can penetrate the native culture, challenge it, and even contribute to subverting it. So, translation studies is a new window. It is a new branch of pedagogical approach in literature. And here, Basnet and Livara argue that uh,
As we come to the end of the 20th century, it is surely time to recognize that an era is over. Writing doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in a context that the process of translating text from one cultural system into another is not a neutral, innocent, or transparent activity. Translation is instead a highly charged, transgressive activity. The politics of translation and the translating deserve much greater attention than has been paid in the past. So translation has played a fundamental role in cultural change. As we consider the diction diachronic of translation practice, we can learn a great deal about the position receiving culture in relation to the source text culture. So comparative literature is a discipline, has had its day. Cross-cultural work in women's studies, in post-colonial theory, in cultural studies has changed the face of literary studies generally. So we should look upon translation studies as a principal discipline from now on, with comparative literature as a valued but subsidiary subject area. So translation studies is not a subcategory of comparative literature. However, translation studies is a principal discipline. And we have got the several analogy and the relation between comparative literature and translation studies. And after getting so many negative views and positive views, we can come to the conclusion that translation studies is in many ways linked to comparative literature. However, it cannot be said that translation studies is a subcategory of comparative literature. It is a principal discipline nowadays. So, thank you all for attending. What happened? So, thank you all. Most probably you have understood a bit. So,